I'm in the Faroe Islands and today we're going to talk all about long exposures. Morning everybody, fantastic to see you all again. I'm back in the Faroe Islands, this time with James Popsys. We're just here for just 2 or 3 days, and what I wanted to do, seeing there's so many amazing waterfalls and we're due for a lot of rain, is talk to you about taking long exposures, the things that I do, the things I think about when I'm taking long exposures. So I'm going to try and take long exposures of all sorts of different things. The sky, obviously waterfalls, the ocean, some waves, and just try and experiment with different exposure lengths and just show you how different that can look in camera. I'm also going to look at polarizers, I'm going to look at ND filters, just to try and create a different effect. And I may even do a composite image of a shot taken with a long exposure of a waterfall, for instance, and then no long exposure on the sky. So I want to just try a few things, experiment a little bit as well. So I'm really looking forward to it. Hopefully we're going to get some amazing weather, and I'm so glad to be back here. It is such a stunning, stunning place. Okay, we found a fairly good spot to do a long exposure. So the first thing to talk about is a long exposure of just seascapes, and what I find for when there's moving water over rocks is around about 1.5 to 3 seconds works really well. Now it depends on how fast the water's going over, but if you go much more than 3 seconds it just becomes sort of mush. So I try exposing at 1 second, maybe 1.5, 2, 2.5 and 3, and then when you've got a good exposure length, big wave coming, so when you've got when you've got the right exposure length, then basically you want to experiment with the tide or the waves coming in and then the waves coming out. And it's a really good idea to look for a part of your composition where water's sort of going over rocks. So you're trying to create lines leading the eye through the image to the sort of distance. Now, on my camera at the moment, I've got a circular polarizer and a 10-stop ND filter because it's the middle of the day. And that seems to work pretty well. I've got it around about, I've upped the ISO a little bit because I've not got a 6-stop, I've only got a 10-stop filter, and it looks pretty good. So I'll take a few of these and then we can have a look at them. So the important thing is just to check the tide times, because otherwise you get really wet. Oh good. So we've now come to the other side of this amazing rock stack. Before we were right over there looking this way, but we managed to get a boat all the way around, and then we've got on the rough side of the ocean. So the water's going a lot faster now, and I've got to really be careful with my shutter speed, because if I have probably 1 or 2 seconds, that's going to be too long. So I've got down to probably around about 1/2 or 1/4 of a second, and I can do that just with my polarizing filter. I want to keep my ISO as low as possible, so I've got it down as low as possible, and I've got it on f13 just to try and, so I'm using my aperture to control the shutter speed. And as long as I'm between sort of f8 and f13, I'm fairly happy with the quality of the lens there. It is so spectacular here, so spectacular. And then the other thing with taking long exposure of water is you've just got to wait. So now's a good time. So if I just switch it on and grab that shot, we've got like some blue here, and it's not all white, and that's quite good because that looks really great. Oh, this is so amazing. It really doesn't get any better than this. This island actually makes a good long exposure shot. So I don't usually do these very much. I've got a 10-stop ND filter in, and the shadows and the sort of highlights in the sea sort of just look a little bit better when the sea's just slightly smoothed out. But I feel that the clouds look better when it's just like probably about a quarter of a second exposure. So I'm going to take 2 exposures and then I'm going to combine them in some magic in Photoshop. So when you're doing this, when you're taking longer exposures and you've got an ND filter in, sometimes you get a colour cast with that filter. Ideally you won't get a colour cast, but if you do, it's usually not a big problem because you can sort that out with the white balance tool afterwards. You just need to take the little dropper in the white balance in Photoshop or Lightroom and just click on something that you thought was about grey, and then you can just tweak it a little bit, or you can just mess about with the white balance. But I think that this looks pretty good. It's got a slightly blue hue anyway, which I think looks really nice. I'm going to take this and we can go and chat about some more long exposures. I really hope you can hear me now because I'm really close to the river, but as you can see I've just set up my camera and I'm going to show you the filters in a minute. But what you can also see is that I'm in the river. I'm actually in the river. When you're doing waterfalls and long exposures of waterfalls, it's really important to have the water coming through your shot. It makes such a big difference to the look and the feel of the image. I've got a polarizing filter on, and I've also got a 3-stop ND filter on to try and get it to around about 1 second, which is what I like for my waterfalls. So I've got it at about 1 second, and I've got a line leading all the way up to the waterfall as well, so you know, your eye can follow the shot all the way up. But it really is all about getting in the waterfall when you're doing waterfalls. Don't worry about getting wet feet, and unlike what I've got today, which is more walking boots, you need wellies. Right, I'm going to get in and take this shot. So as you can see, I'm back in my studio now. I wanted to tell you a little bit more detail about some of the long exposures that I took, because after I've got back, looked at them in Lightroom and started to look at some of the exposures and the shutter speeds, I think there's a lot of information I can tell you whilst I'm back here as well that I didn't tell you when I was in the Faroes. And in terms of that shoot that I just did right at the end, it started to throw it down with rain and I got loads of water specks on, and I wanted to explain that. I still got a shot, which I'm going to show you in a minute, but I wanted to explain that, you know, it was throwing it down with rain, and I didn't get the one that I was just lined up at there, so you won't actually see that shot. But that happens sometimes. That's photography. I mean, the important point is that when you're in a waterfall, you want to get in the waterfall, like I was making the point there, because if you're in the waterfall and you're actually, water's going past you, then it's going to create a much better composition. So this shot here that I took is a good example of that. You can see that it's worked quite well. Now this was actually a 1/5 of a second, and this is something really interesting that I probably didn't realise, if I'm honest, until I started making this video and compiling it, just how different a shutter speed that I use on my photos for taking long exposures, and some of them end up not being long exposures, more like blurred water exposures. So this shot here was a 1/5 of a second, and you can see that the water's still blurred, it works really well, and it just gives you still a little bit of detail in the water. And what I like is that detail in the water. So if you see these two shots here, the first one, I've got quite a long exposure. I think it is, just let me check what it is. Yeah, the first one is 1/3 of a second. But then, because the water's really moving really fast, I felt that I didn't really show the sheets of water coming down in this waterfall. So I ended up on a 200th of a second, still got some blurred motion, and I felt I sort of took that sort of long exposure effect, you know, really well in camera at a 200th of a second. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is you don't have to shoot like 1 second, 2 second long exposures to get the right effect. So let's have a look at some other photos, and we can sort of go through these photos here, and you can see maybe if we start with the longer exposures and go to a faster exposure, just the sort of things that I think work well. So at the longest exposure, and I don't shoot these very much, you know, you might be shooting like a minute long and you might just be blurring very still water, so it might be a lake or something like that, a little bit like the shot I did of the island where I had the blurred water at the front, and it almost looks like milk, I suppose. I don't tend to like that much. So moving up and going a little bit faster. So if I've got a waterfall that I feel the water's creating quite a nice pattern in the water, and it's those streaks out into the dark areas of the water that I want, then I tend to shoot around 5 to 10 seconds. This one here is 8 seconds, and this one was 12 seconds in sky. And I think that works quite well. But then when you get to water in the ocean and waves and fast moving waterfalls, then you're starting to get to faster shutter speeds to capture that movement correctly, which is quite interesting. So this one that you saw, in fact I've got a print of it here, which I've printed out. So this print here, hopefully you can see that. So this water here was a 1/2 second, and I really like that. I think that comes out really well, this 1/2 second exposure in this water. And I tried this at multiple different exposures, but yeah, that worked really well. Now there's a lot of movement in this water, and I had to wait quite a long time to make sure that I got the blue there, because it was so blue. It was so blue, this water, but it had a lot of white sort of froth on it, and that sort of, you know, took away from this blue colour. But the combination of both of them created this really nice texture to the water. But that was a 1/2 second. And so if we look at this shot here, this was a 15th of a second. So this is a wave coming in. This was in Iceland, and the water was just catching the back of it. And I found that a 15th of a second just allowed the water just to move a little bit, and you could almost see the direction the water was taking. You know, these sort of lines that water's creating as it sort of breaks. But don't think that, you know, you can stop at a 15th of a second, because as I showed on the waterfall, that was a 200th of a second. And then this shot here that I took in the Faroes in March, this shot, I remember taking this thinking, oh, I'm going faster and faster and faster to try and capture the movement of this wave. I ended up shooting at a 2,000th of a second. So, and you know, I've still cracked, you know, it's almost frozen it, but I've still got a bit of movement by the wind blowing the water off the top of it and the light catching it. So as you can see there, it makes a really big difference, you know, what shutter speed that you take, and it can really change and impact the feeling of the image. What I like to do is try and just get to the point where I've got some movement, but I'm still creating a little bit of detail. And depending on how fast the water's moving, it depends on what shutter speed you need for that. And also, you just definitely get a polarizer. If you have no other filter, a polarizing filter will be the one to get, and then an ND filter. And none of these did I use any grad filters, so it was just polarizer or ND filter. Okay, just a couple more things. So it's that time of year, which seems a long time off, but this are my top, I think there's 40 photos. These are my top 40 photos from the last year, and 12 of these are going to appear in the calendar. Now I'm going to have a bit of a competition that I'm going to talk to you about next week with these, but 12 of these are going to appear in the calendar, and next week I'm going to be giving away a Benro £400 tripod. So you might want to tune back in next week to find out the details of that. But I really don't know how I'm going to whittle that down to 12 images. It's really hard. It's really, really difficult. Maybe I need to get your help a little bit. And the other thing is that I wanted to mention is I was in the Faroes with James Popsys. If you haven't seen his channel, go and check it out. I'll link it at the end of this video. And next week, I'm chatting to James about a number of things as well. So make sure you tune into that. You know, he's a really knowledgeable guy and a fantastic photographer as well. And I've caught him with a tripod. So you tune in for that as well. Okay, thanks ever so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And until next Sunday, bye.